Morning, everybody. Happy Hump Day. Welcome back to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's Northeast reporter, Jeremy Armstrong. Morning, Jez.
Good morning.
Now, we've been off for a bit, been publicising BBC's new documentary about nuclear test veterans. So we have to get back in the swing of doing these news agendas now. If you haven't caught the documentary yet, I recommend doing so. It's on iPlayer and it's called Britain's Nuclear Bomb Scandal, Our Story. We were showing it in Parliament yesterday, so you'll be in the best of company if you can get to see it. Now, this is the People's Paper Review, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. Those of you listening later on podcasts are just going to have to ask yourselves whose fault this all is. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on what it calls the dawn of a new era as the Labour government rolls out its free breakfast club plan for 750 schools, with applications opening for the pilot, which will start in April. Now, Jeremy, breakfast clubs are an issue right across the country, but certainly in the Northeast where you're based. Can you take us through this a bit? What's being started? Why are they doing it?
It's a test program initially, isn't it, where they're doing several hundred across the country in order to see if they work, and then the plan is to roll it out to all of the 16,000 primary schools across England and Wales. I mean, I think it's such a good idea because the people who are poorest really do struggle to provide breakfast for children. It's particularly big in my home city of Newcastle upon Tyne. Greggs have quite famously been helping out with a very similar pilot scheme in the poorer areas. But it's actually, I think it's a good idea to offer it at least to all children, because I think it's it becomes then a safety net for families who, maybe feel a bit uneasy about it. Maybe the old stigma about, getting free school meals and all that, which was obviously relevant in our day when we were at school. It gets rid of that, doesn't it, if it's offered to everybody? And it just guarantees a good start to the day, effectively. There's lots of research which has been done that shows that, children struggle to concentrate if they haven't had something to eat. And, if there is a need there, then I think it's a brilliant idea, really.
Yeah, I genuinely think that sort of having them actually sort of socialise and eat together is probably also just as beneficial as learning to some extent for quite a lot of children.
There's also the point that's being made about working mums dropping off the kids in order to go to work and giving them the time to do that. And so it's not always about, income. There will be people who are going off to work or dropping off the kids and knowing that they're going to get breakfast, who are in sort of basic terms are middle class, I guess. So it's not just purely about the economic benefits. I guess there is that added dimension of it being a childcare issue to a certain extent.
Yeah, as also into sort of the times that it runs and everything else different to the school run. So what do you think, everybody? Are you looking forward to the introduction of the free breakfast clubs? Is it something you're going to take advantage of? Have you got some kind of concerns about it? Get into the comments and let us know. So this is just the pilot, and the intention is that in 2026, so after it's run for a year, the pilot will be rolled out to all 16,764 primary schools right across the country. So it may well be, the chances are it's not going to come to your primary school straight away, but it will do eventually. But that's just going to cost billions and billions and billions. Isn't there a risk, Jeremy, I suppose, as you were referring to there in some way, that as well as the children who maybe aren't getting a good breakfast at home and the parents who want to take advantage of some early childcare so they can get to work, it's also going to be used by people who could easily afford to feed their children themselves, and they're just kind of taking advantage in a way? That's what people are going to worry about, isn't it?
I guess that is always the case with universal benefits, isn't it? It's the same with the winter fuel allowance. There were obviously millionaires in Chelsea and Belgravia who were getting them, as well as the poorest in the toughest areas of the country. So that I'm afraid that's what one has with the universal benefit. And in this particular context, I sort of think, for how much it's costing, is it worth it? I would contend that it is, because of the great virtue of it, really. The fact that kids will be guaranteed breakfast, you will be able to take them into school early and know that they're going to be cared for, and that really, as we said earlier, all the research indicates that that's really important in terms of their education, their ability to concentrate, and one has the added dimension, of course, of people who are working not having to worry about childcare before they're going to work. So it's a kind of win-win. In what the normal counter argument to doing it on a means tested basis is just the administration of it, to be honest. And when you when you look at individual schools that have to do that, I think that is an issue. That is a major issue. How would you administrate that? You would have to do it either through central government, which would be really tough, or the individual school. And then you've got, the time that it takes to do that would almost, counteract the benefit of just running the club and doing it on the simple basis. You get funding from
the chances of people who really need it maybe not going through that application process, it would all be a bit ridiculous maybe. But what do you think, everybody? Are you perhaps a teacher? Do you know a teacher? Because they don't always have their own children at the same school that they teach at. And so if they're going to get there earlier to run a breakfast club, they've got to take their kids somewhere earlier than the breakfast club start as well. It all gets a bit complicated. Teachers end up with a much, much longer day because these clubs have to be supervised. Of course, the schools have to pay for it. And it's just extra sort of arrangements, I suppose. It's obviously going to be cost to some people, but is it going to be any benefits to it, do you think? Sarah says it'd be abused by those who don't need this facility. I mean, I suppose the point of it is that, it helps all of us. If school children eat a good breakfast, they are more able to learn, they're more able to grow up healthy. It saves money on NHS bills when they're older, on the benefits bill when they're older, if they're more likely to get good education, get good qualifications, get a good job. It brings in tax revenue. It pays for all of us in old age, whether we have children or not. Leslie says it's a brilliant idea. It should be fully rolled out. It worked brilliantly in Wales and my grandchildren loved them. I don't know about your family, Jez. My daughter loves her breakfast club as well. She's 8 and occasionally I have to take her to one at her school because work means I can't make the school run. I just have to get rid of her early, do something else. And the food on offer, from what she tells me anyway when she comes home, is not that healthy. It's not Weetabix or Ready Break, which is what she gets at home. It's packet pancakes full of additives that just get put in a toaster and warmed up. There's sugary drinks, there's brioche buns, chocolate croissants. She loves going to breakfast club, but and it costs £4 a throw at the moment. So I'm happy if it starts being free. But are free clubs, do you think, are they going to be free to everyone? Are they going to be something that perhaps schools ask some parents to contribute to help others out? Do you think there's going to be nutrition? If the government's doing it, like with school dinners, they're going to have to set nutrition rules, aren't they? As they do with school dinners, and say, well, this is your basic. You've got to offer fruit and veg as well. You've got to have this. You've got to have that. Whereas at the moment, we have the situation where schools are running their own breakfast clubs. Greg's are helping them out. At my school, it's whoever can get to the supermarket, find a packet of pancakes to put in the toaster. If it becomes more official, does it get healthier, I suppose, is a question I'm asking.
Yeah, I sincerely hope so. Certainly in Newcastle, when my kids were growing up, they had their breakfast clubs and they were very conscious of that. And there was a balance there. So fruit was offered and fruit juice and, cereals as well as the quicker options that you've discussed there, like pancakes and things. I mean, it depends on funding. It hinges on funding. If it's run by the kitchen staff who've got an intimate knowledge of what the kids like to eat and know them individually and keep an eye on them and, there's a different aspect to it then. I think because they've got that familiarity, then it massively improves the service that you offer. There's no question of that. One would assume if it is a government drive that they will have an eye on that and they will be looking at the nutritional value of it. Obviously, it's always down to individual schools to execute and implement it, but I would hope that there would be a sensible kind of approach in terms of offering what kids are going to eat and what they like, but also give them some kind of nutritional balance. I mean, that's so difficult because some kids are very picky eaters at that age, aren't they? So
she'd end up writing letters to Keir Starmer if you took away her chocolate croissants. But Robert says all parents should provide their children with a good breakfast before they leave home. That's a perfectly valid view, Robert. The other side of this is that children need probably a good 12 hours sleep. Right? So they go to bed at 8, or they need to wake up at 8, 7 o'clock. Sometimes they get a bit older. But as bedtimes change and so on, but they need a good chunk of sleep. So if you have to get to work earlier one day, or perhaps you get a new job and you have to start earlier at that job, how is your child going to have enough sleep to get up, have a breakfast, you get them to school, and you get them to school earlier because you've got to go to work earlier? That's not about a parent being shoddy in some way and not being able to provide for their child. It's just the case that time is what it is. You get your child to bed at a certain time. I can't get my daughter to bed at an hour earlier because I need to go to work an hour earlier. That just doesn't function, I'm afraid. And so it's a case of how you juggle your time to some extent. Granted, probably not his real name. While I believe it's not the state's responsibility to feed our children, I do believe there should be a fully funded breakfast club for all primary schools. My wife, who's a teacher, often pays for certain children in her school to have breakfast. That's the other side of the argument about teachers, isn't it, Jeremy? About whether they have more work to do and have to get their own children to school earlier and so on. But the other side, they're paying for kids to have breakfast because they're otherwise they're not able to learn, and they can't sit and see a child go hungry.
I mean, we all know that they're consistently relying upon the goodwill of teachers to execute these plans. There's no doubt about that whatsoever, because they've got to go in earlier and they're expected to take that into as part of their working day. I mean, what I'd say to the point being made about parents should always give their children breakfast, of course that's true, and there's no question of that. But isn't this just helping them to do that? If they've got other demands, which many people in the modern work environment have, like you were saying about commuting and traveling and the practicalities of dropping them off. If you don't have to do that, then you've got the option to give them a healthy breakfast at home. And this is just a fail-safe, if you like. It's something to fall back on. Is it if, as you say, you have to go into work early, you have to do something, you've got some other commitments. From the less well-off who are struggling to do all these things and keep all those balls in the air, I just think it's a really sensible option to give to people. And when there's no charge, it's difficult to argue with it, really, because it's a means by which they can be looked after in a safe environment. If you are a working mum, and if you're not and you're struggling a little bit to make ends meet, then it gives you the option of a guaranteed good breakfast, gets them in early. As you were saying, you've got all the benefits of the socialisation of the having breakfast together, learning to share and all that sort of thing. It's a kind of win-win, I think, to be honest.
Yeah, it's a bit like, I suppose, the argument about milk, right? School milk that Thatcher took away a long, long time ago. But when I went to primary school, we still got, play school, we still got it at kindergarten and nursery. Before we went to school, we still got a little quarter pint of milk every day. And I can remember when that finally got stopped in what would have been the early 80s. And I don't remember anyone sort of saying, well, parents should give their own children milk. It shouldn't be up to anybody else. The benefit of having milk was always about your health and your long-term nutrition and stuff like that. It wasn't terribly expensive, but it was just seen as a bit of a luxury, and so it got cut. But if they were to bring in free milk again, everyone will go, well, apart from some vegans, of course, but lots of people will go, great. And I suppose breakfast clubs is the same kind of theory, isn't it? So we'll have to see how the pilot goes. We will sort of start rolling out in April. I'm sure we'll come back to this issue between now and then, or at least when it happens. Now, on to one of the big stories of the day. Our colleague Lucy Thornton has a very harrowing tale in the paper today about people at the other end of life from breakfast clubs who are not getting all the help that they need. And she's reporting that end-of-life charity Marie Curie is calling for all people with a terminal illness to get the winter fuel payment that was scrapped by Rachel Reeves in her first budget. Now, Jeremy, can you take us through this a bit? What's Marie Curie's reason for saying that they still need that £300 to help them through the winter?
It's because they're at the most extreme end of it, aren't they? There's some really harrowing accounts of people who are dying and putting on the heating because they're concerned about the bills. It's a kind of a huge issue for the elderly, and it's accentuated obviously if you're terminally ill, you're at home. It doesn't bear thinking about, does it? You're at home all the time through no fault of your own because you are so unwell, and you're worried about paying your heating bills. I do feel it's a really kind of extreme example, this, of some of the small print in the budget, which is having a huge impact, and the notion that these charities have got to highlight it, and where I think it's brilliant that we're actually shedding light on this as an issue in a way, because it seems like a small thing, but if you're in that situation and can you imagine you're dying and you know that you're dying and you're worried about your heating bills, that just seems to me to be such an appalling kind of oversight in the changes that have been made.
You shouldn't have to be thinking about that, should you? And as we just saw in some of the video footage there, people scrolling through a smartphone in order to see what kind of help they could get. Lots of energy companies will offer you things like electric blankets, which are very cheap to run. They will offer you some payment help. There is various government benefits and so on. But getting to all that really requires you to be online, and requires you to be engaged, and requires you not to be so ill or neglecting yourself as you come to the end of life, or have family who can do this for you. And not everybody is in that situation. I mean, what do you think, everybody? How do you feel about, I mean, lots of people generally think the winter fuel payment being scrapped is a terrible idea, but it is still available for people who are the very poorest, but it's means tested. It's something you have to sort of go through a process for now. What's happened to you and your winter fuel payments? You know anyone who perhaps isn't getting it when maybe they should? Orkbot Basher says Labour's genocide on our elderly will never be forgotten. It's a bit strong, but maybe. All too often, it seems, we talk about pensioners as being wealthy property owners, don't we, Jeremy? They've got time, they've got money to spare, they do the grandchild care, all this stuff, and they're off, online or going on cruises or whatever. Many of them are, but among them, even younger too, they're those who have a terminal diagnosis. They're being sent home to die. And as it says in the story that Lucy's written there, often without the family, the loved ones, or their heating, sometimes in some cases even a kettle. There's one nurse in that story quoted as saying she went to see a man in his 80s with no family in some sort of granite cottage in Cornwall. He was desperate to get home from hospital because he didn't want to die in there. And when she went to visit him, all he had was a bed and a heater. There was no light in the kitchen. The nurse was having to use the torch on her phone. And he was obviously neglecting himself a bit, which can tend to happen. But, that's no way to die, is it? And when a charity sends a nurse around to help, they shouldn't be having to tell her, as Marie Curie are, to wear an extra pair of leggings and keep themselves warm. What's gone wrong here, Jeremy? Is it the fact that you think, it was the small print that just didn't get noticed when they were planning this thing in the budget? Or is it the fact that, there is help for them perhaps and they're just not able to access it?
There are many different facets of it, as covered in Lucy's report. I think there's that whole issue of, when you're unwell, will you be in a position where you can go through the small print? Will you be in a position where you can apply for these things and get assistance? That notion that you as you say, you've got to seek out good energy deals and find means by which, like electric blanket is a very simple approach, but a very effective one. This is highlighted because it's elderly people, but I mean, when you sit down and analyse it, that's going to be an issue, as you say, regardless of your age. If you've got a terrible illness of this nature, which dictates that you have to be at home, if you're being cared for at home, if you're in the appalling position where you've been given a terminal diagnosis and you're in end of life care at home, a lot of people want to die at home, don't they? So there's no question whatsoever. It is an issue, and obviously when you get people like they're in the front line, aren't they, the Marie Curie nurses? So one has to take into account, I think, what they're saying, if they feel it is an issue and they're finding people who are vulnerable, who are, at their worst and lowest ebb, who just aren't in a position to look after themselves properly. I think you've got to take that on board and try and make some amendments, to be honest. Try and make some changes to the system. Whether it comes automatically if you get that diagnosis, whether there's a means by which you can do that, I don't know. But, again, you've got the opposite of the Breakfast Club in a way, haven't you? This is the other extreme where, you've got a universal benefit in terms of the Breakfast Club, which is ubiquitous because I feel that's the best thing to do. The problem with the abolition of the fuel, the will fuel allowance, is that it's right across the board. All the people who are really, really struggling were receiving it, as well as the affluent, and the ones who didn't need it. And that's, as we said earlier, that's always a problem with the universal payment. But the ones who are falling through the gaps are people who are really, really unwell. You think there should be some sort of emergency system where that's recognised and that gap is closed, really.
Yeah, it's the comparison between the breakfast clubs and the winter fuel payment is really stark, isn't it? Leslie says the winter fuel allowance doesn't cover the whole of winter. Is an extreme view of this. I was in this position. My husband died and there was no winter fuel allowance. What do you think, everybody? Have you had issues with winter fuel allowance? Do you think it's something that should be universal, even if there are wealthier people who get it too? Do you think maybe, Marie Curie is talking about, they've been reduced to telling their nurses to wrap up warm. Their nurses spend many, many hours in shifts at a time caring for people in an absolutely freezing house. They're not able to go and fiddle with the thermostat and turning heating on and everything else when it's not their responsibility. The patients they're dealing with are already struggling to eat, never mind actually stay warm. Paul says applying for benefits via the internet has been an issue for years. This is an issue that should be addressed. It should be something you'd think that, maybe your GP can sort of start start a process off, not for the GP to apply for it before you, but just to say this person, you know, should go into the system and start getting dealt with, even if it's by post or something. One of the things the charity is calling for is a social energy tariff, one where, you know, if you're in extra need, you get cheaper rates for your gas and electricity. That would probably, you know, they reckon it could help 55,000 people who are terminally ill. Jeremy, does that sound like a sound idea to you? Is there going to be any downsides to that?
What would be really great when you look at the huge profits that these energy companies are making is that they just do that altruistically themselves. When you think about the number of people who are involved, I know it is laughable, but you know they can execute the energy rises. They can charge us a lot more. They can do all of that. Why can't they put a system in place whereby people who are in this position do get assistance and they aren't charged as much and it comes out of their profits rather than being the government funded? I mean, you know, maybe that's a bit naive in you know the conventional capitalist system, if one can put it that way, but they are making huge amounts of money as a result in the rise in the tariffs. And you know, wouldn't it be incumbent upon them to show a little bit of a social conscience, maybe to a certain extent? The problem one has is, as always with these things, is how you identify them, how you execute it. As the last contributor was saying, you know, do you want people to go through the process of having to go into the government, having to go to the benefit system, having to apply for it? Wouldn't it be easier if somehow they could show that they had a diagnosis, whether that was a medical note from the doctor or whatever it was? They show that to the energy company. The energy company says, yes, right, okay, we recognise that and we charge you less for your energy.
Yeah,
I mean, is that going to be, you know, is that going to be sort of detrimental to the huge profits that they're making? I would suggest it's a drop in the ocean, isn't it, really?
Yeah, if there's only sort of tens of thousands of people that might be benefit perhaps from having cheaper energy, there's still millions of people paying through the nose. And of course, what would happen is if the government were to legislate and say, well, we're going to have a social energy tariff and you've got to take it out of your end, guys, they would just raise the price for everybody else, wouldn't they? And we'd all end up paying and their profits wouldn't be affected at all. Della says, tenants of multiple occupancy can't get help. Landlords are the sole name on fuel bills. Yeah, that's another issue, especially you know, people who have not just terminal conditions, but just life-limiting or chronic conditions as well, have a big issue. Now, the government says it is raising the state pension, and people near the end of life do get better access to benefits. But you have to be the sort of person who is not neglecting yourself in an old farm cottage to make the most of that, don't you? You have to be online, you have to have family, you have to have neighbours to help you maybe. You have to be able to navigate the system or have someone who will do it on your behalf, get those applications in. And not everybody does have that. It does seem like if, you know, your GP, for example, can say, well, you have a diagnosis, you're in extra need, you should be able to just send it off to the energy company, like you do a marriage certificate, and they just change your name on the bill. Well, they just send your letter in from the GP and they give you the half rate, you know. I don't think most of us would mind paying a penny or two extra for that, nor that the fat cats could really object to losing a bit of their dividends. And the government's been doing an awful lot this week. They've had respect orders, they've had breakfast clubs, Jeremy, they've had a help to work scheme. They've got this debate today on ending women against violence and girls. This, I mean, it sounds to me a bit like an issue that will get lost in the rush of all the stuff the government's trying to do, really, until someone somewhere says social tariff. That sounds like a...
You've got Sister Dine on Friday as well, haven't you? So, yeah, a number of huge issues which all seem to be happening simultaneously. And as you rightly point out, kind of struggling to get time in the limelight and the sort of scrutiny that they deserve, in a sense. I mean, there's no question whatsoever that something needs to be done to help those people. And Lucy's report is fantastic, I think, in highlighting that. And it's great that we're calling a Labour government to account, you know, in terms of the minutiae of the budget and the details of it, because those people haven't got a voice, and that's what we're here for, to give them a voice. Yeah,
the only thing that's being discussed is how to bump them off quicker. Well, we'll come back to this, I'm sure, and there'll be more stuff about this over the winter, I don't doubt. In the meantime, everybody, if you do know someone nearby you who's perhaps a little bit ill, or you haven't seen them very much recently, or they're having problems with the system, let them know you can get an electric blanket. Give them a hand. Try and help them a little bit if you can, because you know no other bugger's going to be doing it. Anyway, thank you for your help. Thank you for explaining some of that to us, Jeremy. Now, we have managed to find some good news in the world for you after that very grim story. Here it is. Now, when Storm Bert hit Wales earlier this week, many people were taken by surprise, but not a lady called Caroline Morton. She was a dental technician from Pontypridd who looks like she was just doing her washing up when the floodwaters suddenly appeared in the middle of town. And she rushed around all her neighbours, banging on their doors to warn them, single-handedly closing 14 different floodgates to save homes from the deluge. She reenacted it for the Mirror and said it was no more than anyone else really ought to do. But she had to do all that, Jeremy, because National Rivers Wales had not sent anyone to do it for them. No one had really been warned. The floods came really quickly, National Rivers Wales said, but no one closed the floodgates. So it could have been so much worse if it wasn't for Caroline. Is this proof, do you think, that, if we all look out for one another, maybe we might all just make it to next week?
Yeah, I mean, I what I love about it is the fact that she just didn't hesitate whatsoever in terms of, the potential danger to herself, really, in this particular context. Now, listen, it was just brilliant what she did, and it was thinking about others, and it was altruistic, and she was banging on doors, and she was doing something really practical in terms of closing the floodgates. Sometimes I think it's easy to kind of criticize the authorities, saying why weren't the official boards there? But maybe when these things happen, I know it sounds ridiculously simplistic, but obviously, if there is a flood and it happens really suddenly, and maybe that's what is required. That it takes that kind of that quick thinking, if you like, to do that. I accept entirely. I'm sure this was forecast. I'm sure they could have seen it coming and all of that, but. I think the more positive way of looking at it is just what you've just said, that she was thinking about others, looking out for others, knocking on doors, doing really simple, basic stuff that made a big difference. All our neighbours have seen what a difference it made. Clearly, closing the floodgates made a massive difference. But actually, on a personal level, if you got a knock from a neighbour when that was happening, you'd be really appreciative of that, wouldn't you? If you were asleep or you weren't aware that it was happening, and you could take action yourself. So, all power to her elbow. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, combination of taking personal responsibility and the authorities helping out where they can, which I suppose all the stories we've discussed this morning is a mix of that, isn't it? People doing what they can for themselves, and also when you can't, trying to help other people out. Yeah. Thank you for that, Jeremy. We've had a lovely little tie-off at the end of the news agenda. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. If you want to come back to us again at noon on these channels, there'll be Prime Minister's questions being broadcast. I think Keir Starmer was actually in the country for once, so he might actually be in Parliament. We'll be back again next Monday for another edition of the news agenda. Till then, everybody, stay safe, take care, look out for one another, and we'll see you on the other side. Tatty bye.